Welcome, friends, to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week is a weird one because we are supposed to be off. We were supposed to be off. But then I got COVID. I was in Florida for a funeral, and I masked the whole time on the plane and so forth, and I still ended up getting it, unfortunately. I'm feeling better now. But because of that, my vacation over the weekend, where I was supposed to be going camping on the coast, that didn't happen. And we were supposed to record our bonus episode early to get it all done and out of the way so we wouldn't have to worry about it this week, but we didn't do that either because I was sick at the time. So everything's just been thrown into disarray. And then on top of that, half the country lost a basic human right. So there's been a lot that's happened since we last recorded.
Yeah, I'm sick of living in historically awful times. I used to look at a history book and say, like, look at all this progress we've made. Isn't that such a good thing? And it just feels like every entry in the history books, like, for the last, I don't know, forever. It's just we're backsliding in it.
Yeah, and obviously we're two guys, so we're not even as affected by it as women are, and it's still devastating to see, just because of the misery and suffering and death that I know that this decision is going to wreak on our country. We're talking about Roe v. Wade being cast down by the Supreme Court, namely 3 judges that were installed by one twice impeached president to do things that they all said they wouldn't do. It's so much horse shit.
It's bad. I mean, not to mention like the bad faith appointment of one of them after there was a deal kind of thing made. It was like, you're not supposed to appoint somebody right as you're on your way out. Like all of these things. It's fucked. And it's clear, it's clear that somebody's cheating. Some things are happening.
And it lays out the bullshit that is the Supreme Court.
Yeah, honestly, fuck them. I always, historically you're like, oh, that's supposed to be the beacon we look at, and now it's like, can't fucking trust them, can't rely on them to do the right thing.
It's supposed to be impartial, right? Like, that's the whole idea, is that the judicial system is impartial. Yet they are partisan hacks, at least recently, being appointed by presidents. They're unelected, and they serve a lifetime appointment. It's awful. The whole thing is maddening. It can't be defended at this point. I mean, the idea that they're impartial is laughable. Just reading the decision, I think shows that it is right-wing textbook stuff is all through there. Anyway, we have thoughts. And we just watched The Handmaid's Tale 1990 film, that we are going to be discussing on our Patreon episode for this month. It is the original adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, and I have a lot of thoughts. As I was watching that, we thought it was a good time to revisit, and sure enough, it dredged up a bunch of stuff. I went and listened to a little bit of our book coverage, and my God, we were talking about some stuff, and it was so prescient. I don't know. It was like, we were reacting to there was like a Texas ban on I think up to 6 weeks, abortions for the first 6 weeks. Abortions beyond 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. And then there was the whole bounty thing, which ended up, I guess, becoming law there. I don't know. Really fucked up, and we were reacting to that, and then I'm like listening now going, yeah, how about all of Roe v. Wade being gone now, guys? Like, you don't even know how bad it's going to get. And we were talking about, like, if things continue this way, and it's like, yeah, they did. They really did.
And like, I think part of the, like, sort of sci-fi premise of Handmaid's Tale, and we're actually setting up for, from the Vault episode, we'll touch on in a second, but part of the thing about Handmaid's Tale when it came out in 85 is it's like this cautionary tale about like what the dystopia of what could be and everything if we allow like small rights to be taken and things stack up, and it's like it doesn't feel that fucking far off anymore.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. So we will be talking more about this stuff, and if you would like to hear us talk about it, I know we're just 2 white dudes, and we're not the ones directly affected by it, but in many ways it does hit home for me. I've mentioned before how my wife and I are child-free by choice, and just things like that. It hits home, and we'll talk about it more on that episode. But we are setting up here our Epic Pooh discussion, which, strange name when you hear it, it is for me. It is an essay written by Michael Moorcock, who is another fantasy author, and he is comparing, in the essay, Tolkien's writing and The Lord of the Rings to Winnie the Pooh, and that's the Epic Pooh from the title. It is an epic version of Winnie the Pooh. And it's sort of a takedown and a discussion of the conservative values and traditional British values that he sees perpetuated in Lord of the Rings. So I thought this is a good one to put out right now as we're diving headfirst into politics and we're getting in there. This is another good one where we talk about the effects of that and what that means for society as a whole, fantasy as a whole. Like, should it be celebrated? Both of us enjoy Lord of the Rings. I think in the essay we both sort of grapple with the arguments being put forth by Moorcock. We have some pushback. We have things we agree with. I will link in the show notes the essay itself. I think we'll even say in here that I recommend you read it if you want to really follow along what we're talking about. But I thought it was a cool discussion. If you don't mind getting a little political with your fantasy.
I remember talking a lot about the subliminal nature to storytelling and how these things baked into a story might seem innocent, but it can also set up this sort of worldview of its readers and that kind of thing. So
yeah, perpetuate harmful thought patterns that can go on to create problems. And so maybe there is something to that. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this From the Vault episode. And if you would like to hear something all new, do check out our Patreon exclusive episode on The Handmaid's Tale. If you are even familiar with The Handmaid's Tale as a story in any way, you can listen to that one. It's not like you have to watch that movie. And you'll be able to enjoy our conversation about it, I think.
And we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming the following Thursday from when this comes out. So next week.
Yeah, which I think we're doing The Black Phone.
The Black Phone, yeah.
So yeah, nice, hopefully scary, fun horror piece that covers Joe Hill, Stephen King's son. Should be a good one. I'm hearing pretty good things so far, at least, initial buzz. So looking forward to that one, and enjoy. We are going to be tackling something a little different this time. In our Lord of the Rings coverage, we actually mentioned this essay by Michael Moorcock, and it's called Epic Pooh, P-O-O-H. And it's sort of an indictment of Lord of the Rings, written by this other fantasy author and literary critic, Michael Moorcock. And I referenced it to you on the episode, I think, and I tried to sort of briefly summarize it. And we talked about it a little bit, and I said, it would really be better to actually have you read this essay, and then we could talk about it on a bonus episode. And then we kind of forgot about it. But recently we were on another podcast, the That's What I'm Tolkien About podcast. And it kind of reminded me of this essay and that I did want to touch back in with you on it. So I figured it'd be a good time to tackle it now.
Yeah. I mean, this is sort of, in a way, sort of reading this essay reminded me in an analytical way of our last project that we just covered on the actual feed. I'm thinking of ending things. Mm-hmm. And the idea of literary versus genre versus and subjectivity and some of that stuff was coming up as I was reading this.
Yeah, the role entertainment plays in our sort of everyday lives and our perspective on the world.
Yeah, and walking away from it, I do think I remember pushing back against it in the Return of the King coverage when you brought it up and sort of were because you were giving me the cliff notes realistically. I just was
very rough.
I was sort of just I don't know, but it does give you a good perspective, and I think it did change my opinion a little bit because clearly this is a person who's way more well-versed in children's fantasy and epic fantasy and the comparison between the two, and sort of puts forth examples of what, in his opinion, is great children's fantasy literature and what is sort of more watered down. And
yeah, that's interesting. So this is my, I think, third time reading this now. It's the second time in full. I definitely skimmed it one or two other times. And I feel like I've been getting more out of it the more I've kind of revisited it, because it references a ton of different authors. It's a 13-page essay, and maybe half of it feels like it's quotations from different works he's referencing, which is kind of a lot. I felt like maybe a little bit excessive, but he's doing it to try and make points. I would recommend, if you want to be able to sort of fully follow this conversation, to read the essay itself. We'll link it in the description for this episode on Patreon in the show notes. So you can go listen to it. It's freely available. You can go read it. At least skim it. And so you can get an idea, because once again, it's hard to really summarize exactly what argument is being made. I think I've sort of arrived at a point where maybe I could describe it a little better than I did in the episode. I don't know. But I'm curious, before I give that, I want to know what your take was on what do you think he's generally trying to say? What is his overall criticism, if you could try and boil it down to maybe a few points?
I think I think he had 2 or 3, but one of the main ones that was sticking out to me was sort of he was in conversation showing the contemporaries of Tolkien and showing people who came before and after him, people who did similar things to him and people who do different things to him, and showing, because he's this beacon in fantasy, they're showing the differences, showing if he is influential, why is that the case, and sort of I think most of the time he's trying to say that Tolkien, his writing and his style and a lot of things like that, don't necessarily lend itself to being this pillar that he's become in the community, while also saying, the conservative role of the story and what that represents to humanity, and sort of challenging us and what it means to have the status quo remain the same forever and ever and ever. And I mean, I would say for me, I am much more motivated now I think I really want to try to get us to cover some Ursula K. Guin on the podcast soon.
Yeah.
Because that's I think he does a good job of showing the comparison between some authors, and Ursula K. Guin was Le Guin. One that I've never read any of her material, but I'm familiar with Ursi a little bit.
Yeah, Wizard of Earthsea, yeah. And
so I would love to figure a way to somehow cover her on the podcast. But
yeah,
I think those are the 2 major ones, is the sort of more conservative role of the story and
conservative values.
Values, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the sort of comparison to other literature, and why does Tolkien deserve to be on this pedestal?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I absolutely think that's accurate. He starts off by referencing specifically the tone and style of writing, sort of the prose to me, and he likens it to Winnie the Pooh, and he says it's basically this fairy tale writing that is considered beloved by in pastoral England sense. And that's another thing that I want to get across here, is that this felt very British. It is situating it within the realm of British fantasy literature. It references some Americans, but I do think as an American, we're going to have a different perspective on this, because the British countryside to us is almost a mythological land. I know we could go there, but I've never been there. So in many ways for us, it is something of the old world. Whereas for people who live there, I'm sure that people romanticizing the countryside in this way it's just going to hit you differently, because you're yeah, I can go there. It takes me 20 minutes to get there.
Yeah.
It's not a mythological world.
That was one of his points, sort of, right? The idea that if you're to go on vacation, people are much more likely to go on vacation to a city rather than going into nature. And that was one point where I was kind of I mean, that's not a great place to stand on, because I love to get out in nature, and I think that is some of what people are, with the whole Shire idea and the idea of a Shire, which I guess 2 things I would bring up with that is the idea of the Shire. I understand Tolkien spending all that time in the Shire and how that represents sort of his fascination and his want to retain the purity of the Shire and all of that stuff. That part of the story, I definitely agree with the fact that he's getting into very conservative, straight white men are in positions of power, and so the status quo would be for them to remain in power, and older men telling everybody what to do, the wizards of the culture. But the story does go places from the Shire, Yeah. And I wonder, because he didn't really address that as much as I thought that he would, because it's sort of an indictment on the Shire and not as much on the story fully all the way through.
Yeah.
And I know we do Return to the Shire, and I know we like the Return to the Shire, had it been sort of more similar to the movie where everything's back to, innocence and the Shire is still the same. That would be one thing, but in Tolkien's version of the events, it's not really the case. So I did definitely push back against that in his essay, this idea of people not being as interested and yearning for nostalgic for nature, because I love to go camping. I love to be out in nature, and I find it to be rejuvenating.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that part because I think he was saying that people who live in cities are nostalgic for that. Am I misremembering?
Right, that's what he was saying.
Yeah,
and this idea that they wouldn't those people who are nostalgic for the countryside would also probably go on vacation to some European town or something like that, somewhere where there is civilization and city, and it's not the countryside that they're going to visit when they do have a chance.
I see. So yeah, okay. So they say they want to go to pure countryside where what they actually want is a city, is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to read some quotes here. I figure we can kind of react to them. I have a few highlighted because I thought they were interesting. And the first thing I want to start off with is early on in the essay when he's sort of taking a shot at the prose of Tolkien. And really he's lumping in C.S. Lewis and several other authors under this. The author of Watership Down, I think he also
Richard Adams.
Richard Adams, yeah. So here we go. He says, the sort of prose most often identified with high fantasy is the prose of the nursery room. It is a lullaby. It is meant to soothe and console. It is mouth music. It is frequently enjoyed not for its tensions, but for its lack of tensions. It coddles. It makes friends with you. It tells you comforting lies. It is soft. So he likens, and then he has a quote from Winnie the Pooh, and then he likens Tolkien to that.
Yeah, I want to get your take on that because
So I think he's right, and that is the style of language, and I think he's right. It is a comfort. It is attempting to console us. I guess my fundamental problem with this argument is how one-sided it becomes. This is he shows the sort of arrogance and self-righteousness that I feel like only a literary critic can show. If you read literary criticism that is tearing down some famous poet or some famous author, and they're so confident in that they are just skewering this, and that's how this is written, right? It is so confident. And I get that is almost a literary device in and of itself, because the more confidence you show, the more effective an argument you're building. But it always is a little off-putting to me as someone who tries to write myself and writes myself. It's I don't have that level of confidence about anything related to writing. There's so many valid, interesting pieces of work out there, and to pretend that I understand all of them and all the different ways in which they can be enjoyed by readers is ridiculous. And so I get frustrated with the idea. It's yes, he's right. It is comforting. Yes, he's right that it's soft, and that maybe it is telling ourselves lies. But it's almost like he's indicting us for finding a teddy bear to be soft. It's it's designed to be that. And how dare we find comfort in it? Well, it's designed to be comforting, and I understand that if all you ever did was surround yourself with teddy bears, then sure, that's a problem, but sometimes that's what people want. So
I think I think the essay comes from a place of frustration for people who will only consume Tolkien and become fixated on Tolkien.
Yeah.
Because I felt the same way. I was you're being so elitist with the way that you're approaching stories, that you're telling people that they have to listen to your form of escapism in order to truly have the correct escapism.
Right.
And this idea that you're not allowed to something that is, like you said, not challenging is, I mean, it's ridiculous. Everyone at some point in their life is going to come to a point where they'll say, I want something comforting right now. You know what I mean? Whether it's where they're at in life, where they're at, just mentally at that point. And I understand how this story reinforcing sort of political like conservative values that could be damaging to others is a problem. But this idea that just because something isn't challenging doesn't mean it doesn't have worth was something that I didn't really, respond well to.
It's interesting because like I don't disagree with almost any of the points he makes. I disagree more with the assertion that it is the only way, and that we should. I don't know. Like he's making an argument that something that is incredibly popular and celebrated shouldn't be as incredibly popular and celebrated as it is. So he's probably aware that he's only at most going to put a small dent in that popularity. So it's not like he is waving a magic wand and destroying Lord of the Rings from society. He can't do that, and he knows that.
I wanted to say something here that came up to me in this essay is in the way that it changed my perspective on Tolkien is because I don't have the background in children's fantasy like he does. My experience and like the things that influence me to be interested in storytelling are things like Tolkien, and so I look at Tolkien as everyone does. I feel like, and this is what he's sort of like making an argument against. When I look at Tolkien, I'm seeing his writing, and it is sort of it's not of this era of writers. You know what I mean? It's from a foregone age of people writing a certain type of way. And so since I haven't read a ton of writing in that sort of vein, I feel nostalgic for it. I see it, and I'm like, wow, this is really unique. And I feel like maybe he influenced so much. And so for me, what this essay has done is sort of shifted the way that I think of Tolkien as a writer as like, oh my gosh, he innovated so many things. He created worlds and no one could ever fathom before. And he created like archetypes within fantasy, when that's not necessarily the case, right, as far as the essay is concerned.
Yeah.
And so like going forward, I think
he popularized many of them, but didn't necessarily create them.
And so like his prose, I've always been really taken with his prose, and I still will be, but I will acknowledge the fact that he didn't necessarily he's not the inventor of it, as I feel like I've probably said in the past. And I'll acknowledge that the storytelling devices and the things we talked about this when Arnzen was on our podcast recently, it's that some stories are just happen to hit at the right time and hit society in the correct way. And I think that's part of what happened with Tolkien and with Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. You could make that argument for almost any bestseller. So yeah, I think it applies here as well. So I'm going to read another quote, and this is where he's getting more into the reason that he is against this sort of comfort in our fantasy. So this is about Tolkien. He claimed that his work was primarily linguistic in its original conception, that there was no symbols or allegories to be found in it. But his beliefs permeate the book as thoroughly as they do the books of Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis, who, consciously or unconsciously, promoted their orthodox Toryism in everything they wrote. Now, a reminder for our American listeners that the Tory party is the conservative party of Britain. Mm-hmm. So he goes on to say, I don't think these books are fascist, but they certainly don't exactly argue with the 18th century enlightened Toryism with which the English comfort themselves so frequently in these upsetting times. They don't ask any questions of white men in gray clothing who somehow have a handle on what's best for us. And so he's saying that Lord of the Rings props up this idea, this old idea, and this is something we talked about in our coverage. The old white men know what's best in Lord of the Rings, and they're there, and it's like it's a disagreement between old white men, but like everybody else is just kind of caught up in it, and nobody else is at the table, nobody else is making decisions here for the most part. And that's true. This is an accurate description, I would say, of Lord of the Rings.
Right. Which is where that's what I mean. Like I agree. I agree with you agreeing with the fact that that all of his, he makes good points, and he makes points that I think are cutting down to the core of why it can be dangerous is this idea of this is what Make America Great is fucking built on, like this idea of the status quo. Don't you remember when you were a kid and your mom stayed home and your dad worked and everything was, you know what I mean? Like they're talking about the nuclear family of like the 1950s and 40s and that kind of thing. And
specifically the British version of that, but yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just equating it to Americans.
Sure.
Like sort of the way that can be dangerous is people sort of always yearning for when they were in power and others were suppressed. like that. And that's the whole, old men in gray cloaks situation.
So he goes on, I'm going to read another quote. He says, "The Lord of the Rings is a pernicious confirmation of the values of a declining nation, with a morally bankrupt class whose cowardly self-protection is primarily responsible for the problems England answered with the ruthless logic of Thatcherism. Humanity was derided and marginalized. Sentimentality became the acceptable substitute. So few people seem to be able to tell the difference." So I think there is a distinction there in like what I'm taking to be his read on sort of English conservatism. And that's a sentimentality and yearning for, I mean, I guess it's not that different, but yearning for time past and linking it to the old England, the old English way, and how there's this like ongoing stripe of this sort of thinking in the society that he's recognizing, and he's tying it to Lord of the Rings, and he's saying it's all the same stuff. It's the same. It's the old man who's unwilling to change and is voting conservative all the time. Like, this is going to be the kind of literature that he props up as the best book, the best books of all time. And I can see, like, if you live around this kind of thinking constantly, how it could be really frustrating when you start to identify that Lord of the Rings is sort of sharing that same DNA.
And I mean, it's so, to me, it's funny to look at like world history and think of the fact that like, it's just peaceful countryside and all this stuff. And meanwhile, like, go back a few more hundred years and England is trying to take over the entire world. They're constantly colonizing places and trying to take over land and all this stuff.
Well, he even says that it's like, it's a fantasy. It's not even real. It's this like, it's this made up idea.
It's like England forgot about all of that post World War I or II or something. And then sort of just like, let's just relax after the wars in the countryside before the Industrial Revolution really kicks off everywhere.
Yeah.
And that specific time period is like something that they've latched onto.
So he also likens the hobbits to the sort of working class. And it seems like the working class, like conservative types who don't want to change, just like fondly hold on to a mythological idea of better times. And so to me, it's like, it's likening it to rural America, who often votes Republican, right, in America, and how it's the same idea. It's like you have the ruling class, but then you also have the sort of more common folk and their hearty wisdom, and how they hate elites and they hate the cities and they hate people who read and they hate all this stuff. Like, they'd rather just like stick to their simple truths that they believe in. And he's likening the hobbits to them. He says, like, that's the hobbits. And then he goes into this quote, which I'll read another one here. "This is not to deny that courageous characters are found in The Lord of the Rings, or a willingness to fight evil, never really defined. But somehow those courageous characters take on the aspect of retired colonels, at last driven to write a letter to the Times, and we are not sure, because Tolkien cannot really bring himself to get close to his proles and their satanic leaders, if Sauron and company are quite as evil as we're told. After all, anyone who hates hobbits can't be all bad." So he can't help but throw in a little jab there. Yeah, I mean, he's making a point. It's like, we don't actually see them being evil. We're just told they're evil. We never really get close to Sauron. That was something I pointed out in there. Like, we see Saruman is the sort of villain we understand the most, and even him, it's like he's just kind of evil. But yeah, we're just told how bad it is, and we're shown the effect of it. I don't know.
Yeah. It's this, and you think from the perspective of a hobbit who is in that, if we're equating hobbits to conservative, sort of common, everyday blue collar workers or something like that, then who is the unseen evil force? Yeah, the opposition, right?
It's like
so
the urban world, right? Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that way, it's just propping up this idea that like. And for me, it's always been like the more exposure that I have in a city, like being around more, culturally different people, and it's like I feel the opposite is true. You know what I mean? Like, you come to realize how safe cities actually are, how forward-thinking people are, and like what that can lead to in communities, and just all of that. And then there's some like isolationist part of people who like to stay in the countryside, like they say, and sort of live simply, and that's their way of staying safe. And then because those people are the other, they see them differently. They'll never have a door open to even like bridge any sort of communication there.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I wonder if this is part of the reason why Tolkien would constantly push back on these sort of comparisons, because he didn't want. He's like, no, it's not about that. It's not about anything. It's just a story.
Yeah.
Which, like, it's you can't. It never is. It never truly is.
Yeah. Your part of you is going to be in it. Whether like your beliefs, whether it's on purpose or not. Yeah. Like this story is filled with sort of what I'm sure he felt was the right way to do things and the right way society should be run and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, the story is literally about good versus evil. So like you can try to equate in Tolkien's mind like what he sees as good and what he sees as evil. If you look at like the political structure of Middle Earth, and you look at like sort of the roles of certain types of people, certain genders of people, that sort of thing.
Well, that's a good point, because simplistic moralistic views of the world in many ways are going to be tied into a mythologized past, right? Like when we think back in the day, we think about like these struggles of good versus evil. That's often what is in our folklore. And it's like the simplified versions of the world bring us comfort. It's comforting to think of the, the good knight besting the evil dragon or what have you. He is sort of just like pushing back against that, and he's trying to say like there's danger in doing that all the time, and I agree with that, but it's hard to deny the appeal of that kind of story, because I can be someone who believes in a more morally nuanced universe and understands that rarely, if ever, in our society is it that simple, but I can still read and enjoy a story that's set in a universe where it is that simple. And it doesn't mean I'm going to read it and take it to be a sort of like how-to for my life. I don't know.
And I think that's where like I said, I think that's where the essay is specifically sort of focusing its a message on people who fixate on Tolkien as the beacon, as the creator, as the godfather of all of this. Whereas like I think like both of us agree that there's room for both things. There's room for a conservative story about good versus evil. It doesn't have to be, like you say, a how-to book. And you can also get into something much more literary that's really challenging and can change your beliefs on like, real world issues or something like that, just giving you a different perspective. It really is the fact like that's the thing I walk away with, is that Moorcock is specifically, I think, trying to have the conversation with people who say that Tolkien is the messiah of like modern fantasy.
Right. Yeah. And there, you will still find people who will say that sort of thing. Okay, so this is sort of referencing back to something we've already talked about, but I have this quote highlighted and I think it's worth reading. Since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, at least, people have been yearning for an ideal rural world that they believe to have vanished, yearning for a mythological state of innocence, as Morris did, as heartily as the Israelites yearned for the Garden of Eden. This refusal to face or derive any pleasure from the realities of urban industrial life, this longing to possess again the infant's eye view of the countryside, is a fundamental theme in popular English literature. And so, like you said, I think it's the fact that he sees this everywhere, that is popular. It's popular in the children's books. It's installing this like sense that if you grow up in a city, you should be yearning for the countryside of old, even if it isn't real, like not in the way that it's being mythologized. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can take a lot of things from this to apply to American society as well. Like the longing, like you said, to make America great again is all about yearning for a time in which only benefited a certain section of society, and that was specifically straight white men, and everybody else, it wasn't beneficial to them. Yet we've sort of imbued that into our society to try and convince everyone that this is what we should be yearning for, that this was a great time for all, even though that's a lie. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what he's seeing here too, in England instead of in America.
Yeah, and it is. I totally agree with his argument that it's dangerous to have so if Tolkien is the modern godfather of all these stories, the influence is there. People, you can see it everywhere. You can see the influence of Tolkien and tons of fantasy that's come since. And he makes the argument that somebody could take sort of the same framework and make something that's more artistically rich than Tolkien did.
And we should also point out this essay was written in 1978. Now, he has come back later and updated it, I think, with some more modern references. He references J.K. Rowling, for example.
At one point, when I started the essay, it said 1978, and then I saw J.K. Rowling's name in within the essay, and I was like, "What the hell's going on here? Is he a time traveler?"
He's saw into the future. Yeah, he's updated it a little bit over time, but I think it's mostly just to include some more modern references to back up what he's saying. But I think it is also important to know this essay wasn't written 5 years ago or something. It was 1978. It's a long time ago. Yeah. He does seem to have sort of a derision for American writers who are emulating this style, in the sense that he references it as if they're writing in a second language that they barely understand. Really damning. In fact, at one point he takes a really sort of vicious shot at Terry Brooks, I would say, who is a well-known sort of Tolkien-esque fantasy writer. I have a few more quotes I wanted to read, so let me get into them. So I sometimes think that as Britain declines, dreaming of a sweeter past, entertaining few hopes for a finer future, her middle classes turn increasingly to the fantasy of rural life and talking animals, and the safety of the woods that are the pattern of the paper on the nursery room wall. If the bulk of American SF can be said to be written by robots, about robots, for robots, then the bulk of English fantasy seems to be written by rabbits, about rabbits, and for rabbits. Which I think is kind of funny.
I thought it was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Again, just the idea of talking animals and just the sweet nursery rhymes. It's the stuff of the nursery rhyme wallpaper. He's saying it's a lie, and it's something that people are really holding up.
Well, and it's not to mention the countryside and the Pooh reference, the Winnie the Pooh reference. There's very much sort of the world, the 100-acre wood, right? From Winnie the Pooh is very. It is sort of I feel like I didn't realize this growing up, but it is a very British sort of rural society.
Yeah.
And you've got your the rabbit is sort of the farmer and yeah, I don't know.
It's been a long time since I've read it, but I think I remember that.
I understand why the comparison is being made, and the obvious epic Pooh title is a...
Yeah, he's saying that's what that sort of Lord of the Rings is, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's an interesting one. So this is, he's engaging with an argument about escapist fiction being, fine, and then sort of giving a counter argument. So here we go. He is quoting here Lynn Carter. Quote, "The charge of escapist reading," says Carter, "is most often leveled against fantasy and science fiction by those who have forgotten or overlooked the simple fact that virtually all reading, all music, poetry, and art, and drama, and philosophy for that matter, is a temporary escape from what is around us." So that is the argument that all reading, it's all escapist. And so when someone calls something escapist in a negative way, this is the response to say, it's all escapist. Okay. So we established that. Then he goes on to say, "This, of course, is the response of those deeply and often unconsciously wedded to their cultural presumptions, who regard an examination of them as an attack. An unorthodox view, such as that of Tolkien's contemporary David Lindsay, is regarded as a negative view. This, of course, is the response of those deeply and often unconsciously wedded to their cultural presumptions, who regard examination of them as an attack." So he's likening this to another author who is he's having an unorthodox take on fantasy, right? And people look at it and often will look at it and say it's negative. It's depressing. And I hear this a lot too. If something is critical of the status quo, it's regarded as negative and depressing. And that's why literary writing is often considered negative and depressing. And they're like, oh, I don't want to be depressed. I want to read something uplifting. Often that means I want to read something that re-solidifies and endorses my status quo, my worldview, and is comforting to me. Right. So he's making the comparison of that defense of escapist fiction is ignoring that reality, I guess he's trying to say.
In my opinion, this is getting into sort of semantics and like subjectivity and stuff here. So you're saying that all art is escapist.
Right.
But then some is more important escapist than other escapist stuff. So it's like you're telling people how they have to escape. And I think if all you consume is sort of surface level escapism, that's a problem. I would also say if all you consume is deep sort of mind altering, perspective changing, escapism, if that's all you consume also, I would say that you're probably going to be exhausted. Like I think that you're like mentally going to not be able to handle that on a day-to-day basis. He
likens Tolkien's sort of writing and other writers of that kind to being intellectually equivalent to like bland cabbage is his description, right? Eating bland cabbage versus eating more interesting foods.
And so if you're only eating bland cabbage all the time, I understand. But if you're aware of the fact that I'm doing this as an escape and this is my mindless entertainment, and I will go back to dive back into more critical thinking and that sort of work, then I think there's a place for both things.
Yeah.
And maybe that's our modern sensibilities, and that's like us becoming, in his opinion, dumber as a culture, and it's going to lead to us being morons and only doing, not challenging escapism for the rest of our lives.
Sure. Let me read the final paragraph, or not the whole paragraph, but the final portion of the last paragraph of this essay, where he sort of sums it all up. So I have to read this part because it's referencing an author we've covered. Terry Pratchett once remarked that all his readers were called Kevin. He is lucky in that he appears to be the only Terry in Fantasyland who is able to write a decent, complex sentence. So there you go. There's your little jab at Terry Brooks. Got him. Also Terry Goodkind, maybe. I don't know if he was writing back in 78 or maybe. I don't know.
He's not pulling any punches for any of the people in the literary community.
Okay, so he goes on. That such writers also depend upon recycling the plots of their literary superiors and are rewarded for this bland repetition isn't surprising in a world of sensation movies and manufactured pop bands. That they are rewarded with the lavish lifestyles of the most successful whores is also unsurprising. So again, likening them to whores is an interesting choice. Okay, here we go. And then finally, quote, to pretend that this addictive cabbage is anything more than the worst sort of pulp historical romance or Western is, however, a depressing sign of our intellectual decline and our free-falling academic standards. So again, he is pushing back on the idea that Lord of the Rings is being held up as a great exemplar of literature, right? Like it seems like someone somewhere said that like J.R.R. Tolkien is better than James Joyce or better, you know what I mean? And like he got so mad that he had to go write this essay.
He represents literature. He's the height of literature and what literature can describe and that sort of thing. And like some of the things he says I agree with, some of the things I don't. Some of the things he says I don't. And the idea that we see it all the time. People just watch mindless television. They watch, like things that I see is just like that to be lacking any sort of like artistic expression or anything to take away and like change your perspective or anything like that. If that's all you watch, I condemn that. Yeah. I say that is sort of what he's talking about. This, and we also have to say that this is all fairly pretentious to say like,
oh, absolutely.
It's the decline of academics and education and all of this is like to say that only what you say is academically fulfilling is so. Yeah. And so anyway, this idea that there are people who are only consuming the same thing over and over, and maybe there's not a lot of like artistic merit to sort of sink your teeth into, that is definitely going on. Yeah. But the idea that people aren't aware of it, and I think that's the main thing, is that if you're aware of it and you're willing to approach things challenging some of the time, hopefully that we won't, as a society, become too stupid and lack all academic pursuit.
I'm going to tie this to one of the biggest conversations I feel like, is happening right now in film. And I know it's one you have a lot of opinions about. This is like as if someone lauded like Avengers Endgame and said it was the greatest film to be made in the last 20 years. And then some critic was like flipped out and wrote an essay about how like Marvel films are deteriorating our ability to recognize good cinema. And like we've been seeing this sort of thing. Martin Scorsese has come out and said stuff like this. And it's the same argument in many ways, right? Like it's and it's like, it's not to say that there isn't anything there in those films, but like they're also not wrong. Like it's not the greatest artistic piece of work ever made, and anyone who says that is lying too. So I don't know. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Like it can still be a good movie without being that.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, and of course, like from Scorsese's perspective, and you know what, I think Tolkien has this issue as well. This idea that like something like a Marvel movie or Tolkien is swallowing up real estate for everyone else to try to take up to compete in the market and all that kind of stuff.
That was true in fantasy for a long time. I think it's starting to get a little better now, but for a long time it was like Tolkien. It was Tolkien, all day. It seemed like.
Yeah. And so, that is the same argument. I agree. If someone was looking for like a 1-to-1 comparison, it's there. It's the people who are going around saying that these giant blockbusters are the most artistic movies in the world.
That they should be winning best film and for the, Oscars every year and stuff.
And to be honest, like I to Moorcock's point, I genuinely think it's just lack of exposure. I think that if that's the only thing you've ever seen, it very well might be the best thing you've ever seen.
Yeah.
But just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not better than...
And it's not... I mean, there are people who watch other kind of movies, and I think he's getting at more like... There are people who watch other kind of movies that challenge their point of view, challenge the status quo, challenge the comfort of the heroic individual, for example, that Marvel represents. And if they see that being built up, it's comforting to them and they love it, versus a movie that maybe pokes holes in that and challenges that conception and how they're going to find that depressing. And so often you hear about how like great movies, right, are all these like depressing movies, and he's saying that's because they're challenging the status quo and are viewed as negative, whereas something that doesn't is viewed as positive.
There's a lot to this essay. Like I said, I walk away with differences. I feel differently about Tolkien, and he made a lot of great points, and there were other things that I definitely don't agree with. But it was definitely interesting to read, and I think in just like the quotes that he posted in his essay and like the comparison points that he had, I feel like I understand prose of the time a little better because there's so many examples, and it's just a drop in the bucket, but like at least I somewhat can comprehend where he was at with the comparing sort of writers of the time.
Absolutely. And I'll once again recommend you actually read the essay, see the quotations he includes. For the very least, it could be some authors that you might not know about that he might expose you to, because I mean, this guy knows what he's talking about. He's incredibly well read. He's got a huge selection in which he's making these comparisons. So I don't know. It's difficult for me without having read all of the same stuff to engage with each individual one. Yeah. This is truly a literary critic writing, full in his power. And in many ways, this document feels intended for fellow critics to read and respond to. It doesn't feel like this was designed for the masses. I wonder if that's why I hadn't really heard of his essay until fairly recently. Because I don't see this being kind of thrown around as like on Twitter, like, here, read this essay. It's a complete takedown of Tolkien, because it's a literary criticism essay. It's kind of difficult, I think, just for the average person to engage with. But
to reference something that we said recently in our, I'm thinking of ending things. The New Yorker audience would enjoy this essay, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's true. Anyway, I think we continue to operate somewhere in the middle. We dabble on both sides. I don't know if that's going to be. I personally like that position, but I'm not here to tell anyone, they're wrong if they firmly believe, that it's better to do one or the other exclusively. Like, I get it. But yeah, I think this is a good place to leave it for this bonus episode. Unless you have anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, I guess I would just say that like diverse reading and for me, it's always been about, like you said, both. It's always been about consuming everything and then sort of finding things to like in things and finding things to not like in things, and then I feel like to just like sort of have blanket statements is always scary.
Yeah, and that's something that very little about race and gender is mentioned in this essay. There's a little bit here and there, but I agree. I think finding writing from different perspectives, different cultures, outside of the sort of, cis hetero white man authors is going to be beneficial for this too, because inherently the perspective is going to be different than if you only read that sort of writing. So there is value to be had there for sure. But we're going to leave it here. Hopefully you enjoyed this. It was a little unusual for us, but if you're interested in this sort of thing, pass along any sort of essays or anything like that you might have found for older works or even newer ones. And if they're interesting enough and they feel like they're meaty enough, maybe we'll tackle them on future bonus episodes. If this wasn't really your thing, then you can let us know that as well. That's fine. And maybe we won't do this in the end. But we thought this was a fun one to try and get into. But yeah, that's going to be it for this month. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.